What are we going to get into? I told you last week what we were going to get into.
You did. So you're very good at the end of a week throwing something out there, and then we never come back and talk about it again. But I wrote it down and I took notes, and I went back and listened. And you said that you're going to talk to us about managed identities and Azure Automation. So last week we kind of closed out talking about some changes that were coming to Azure Automation and run as accounts, and how you're going to have to really stop using run as accounts. Like, they were never a great idea in the first place. They required all sorts of elevated permissions, usually at the subscription level, to make things happen. And you were always better off with some type of service principal and or managed identity. So you had mentioned that in your world where you're using Azure Automation, just to kind of make sure I have it framed up the right way, you go ahead and use a bunch of other modules. I think, and probably in your world, playing around in the M365 space, those might be things like the Exchange Online module or things like that to interact with like Exchange as a service, and then rely on arguably like it's half-baked managed identity support and things that go into that. If I framed it up the right way, why don't you regale us with a tale of your woes of Azure Automation and managed identity?
Yeah, so you framed it up pretty well. And this one deals primarily with the Microsoft Graph and the Graph module. So the new MG get MG stuff, which can interact with a bunch of different things. And this came out of a client requirement. So
as they do.
As they usually do, which usually leads me down some rabbit hole I had no intention of going down, nor knew existed. This one in particular was around getting user presence. So we were trying to troubleshoot, analyze some of Microsoft Teams phone systems. So they're using Microsoft Teams, and they have some call queues, some routing, some auto attendance. And we were trying to really analyze how calls were going through, whose phone was ringing, were they answering it, were they not answering it, was it because it was ringing, was it not ringing, were they in a certain status, all of this. So we wanted to correlate certain reports with user status. If somebody else knows of one, I would love to hear it. As far as I know, there is absolutely no way to track user statuses when a phone rings. So like, you can get a whole bunch of reporting from the Teams phone. There's some Power BI reports. There's some third parties that do some reporting that all interact with some of the backend APIs in Teams. But none of them like grab point in time status of a call came in, a call hit this particular queue, these 5 users were in the queue, and this is what the status of these 5 users was when said call hit the queue. So my solution, in all my brilliance, or not so brilliance, was let's write a PowerShell script that runs like every 20 seconds and goes out and grabs the user status of all these different queues. We just wrote it to a spreadsheet because we were just doing it for a short period of time. Write all these statuses to a spreadsheet and then go do it again 20 seconds later, and doing it all in Azure Automation. We actually got it working. It did work. I would get about a 40,000 row spreadsheet every 24 hours.
Okay. If that's what we're calling working, is an overwhelming spreadsheet, sure.
It's an overwhelming spreadsheet that has a bunch of data in it. It was a little hacky, so more of the backstory on how it all started working was a Logic app you can schedule to run that quickly. You can set it so it runs every 20 seconds. A runbook you cannot. Runbooks, I think, are every minute is the most frequently you can trigger it. So I have a Logic app on a timer, runs every 20 seconds, goes and triggers a runbook. It's not super precise based on when it kicks off in Azure Automation. Maybe it's 20 seconds, maybe it's 30 seconds, maybe a couple of them end up overlapping. Whatever it is, it actually worked. And I had this running for like 5 days, and Microsoft didn't penalize me for hitting the Microsoft Graph and grabbing user presence every 20 seconds.
It's like a Rube Goldberg machine, though, right? Like it's a deck of cards just waiting to crumble underneath you between the function being the trigger for the thing that calls
Yep.
Azure Automation. Like you worked around the lack of, I guess, scheduling flexibility in your cron engine by building your own kind of machine on the outside to handle it and push it through. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm surprised
So
you don't get
as I was,
throttled more on the graph side of things, I guess,
you
over
know what?
time, right? Like number of executions in there, because they always seem to hit at weird times, the throttles on the graph side.
Yeah, and that was one thing that surprised me is I never really did seem to hit a throttle on the graph as far as I could tell. So the backstory of is in order to get it running this frequently, first I went in and tested it all, and there is a commandlet that's part of the graph. It is get mg user presence. And this commandlet allows you to go in and do exactly that. You can pass in a user ID, which is the GUID. This is not, as far as I know, I think I tried it with a UPN, one of those that didn't work. I had to use the GUID or the GUID or whatever you want to, however you want to pronounce it, to get the user presence. I ran through this, did it all locally, would do like the connect-mg graph. Great. Everything works. I'm able to grab the user presence. So now I go down the path of how do I get this running in an Azure Automation account? Which this is where it leads into yesterday is, okay, managed identities. You can connect to the Microsoft Graph with a managed identity and go run all these commandlets. So I set up my runbook, got all connected, went in and gave the app, so managed identity, and this is where it started getting a little goofy, gave the managed identity the app only permissions, because when you connect with a managed identity, it is app permissions when you go in to the managed identity in Azure AD and go set up all the permissions. Gave it grab presence, all of that, all the documented permissions that it needed, and tried to run my Azure Automation runbook. And lo and behold, got a 403 forbidden. I was like, okay, Graph has these permissions. I can connect to it with my account locally, connect to Graph, grab it, but managed identity is throwing an error. So I started digging in, and guess what, Scott? If you go look at the Microsoft Graph REST API version 1.0, it lists out permissions for the get presence endpoint. Delegated delegated personal account and application permissions are not supported for get presence. You can only do delegated permissions.
Is this another thing? So we went through this a little while back in the Graph Explorer, where the Graph Explorer shows one set of permissions and then the documentation potentially diverges from that. And then the truth is somewhere in the middle between V1 and V2 and what actually is required to keep things up and running.
Working, and I did not look. I should go look. I just flipped over to the API beta. It is still not supported for application level permissions for get presence. It is still only delegated permissions. So Scott, I got stuck.
It's that weird, wonderful world of like OAuth meets all the things that you want it to do, and then these crazy permission models within various services.
Yeah, and I got into this weird scenario where I'm trying to think, if I had gone in, why didn't this work? Managed identity, like I could have stored credentials in the Azure Automation runbook and used those stored credentials to connect to Microsoft Graph. But I want to say, for whatever reason, that wasn't working. Or maybe at that point in time, I'm trying to think. No, because we had security defaults on. So that forces MFA, which means you can't use any type of stored credentials. And even I think I tried to bypass MFA and use stored credentials. And I don't think Microsoft Graph allows you, that was it. Microsoft Graph doesn't allow you to do basic auth to the Graph endpoint to get the user presence.
It does not. I mean, you've got to come through and use modern authn to get there, be it doing like a bearer token type of thing on behalf of an individual. It could be, case of a service principal and doing kind of app ID and client secret and
Yep. But guess what that
getting
is?
your token
That's
that way.
application level permission.
I know that it is.
So here is my dilemma. I can't connect to Microsoft Graph with basic auth, so I can't use the username and password. I can't get the presence with application level permissions. So I was stuck for a while at this point in time of just racking my head. You can't do client secret. You can't do certificate based. I think I tried to work around some things with certificate based, but certificate based is still a service principal, which is still application level permissions.
Mm-hmm.
Beat my head against the wall of how can I get a token with delegated permissions running against the Microsoft Graph to get the user presence. And I stumbled across a nifty little PowerShell module. Have you ever seen the msal.ps PowerShell module?
I have not played around with that one. So msal is the Microsoft authentication library. So it's kind of the modern authn library. So this is interesting. This looks like it comes from the Azure AD team.
It does come from the Azure AD team. So it's like a legit module. It's not some random module I pulled off of GitHub into a client environment. It comes from the Azure AD team, and this lets you perform it's not even a basic, but I can use stored credentials. I still had to go bypass MFA for my service account, but I was able to use stored credentials, username, password to go get a delegated token for a user and then take the token that I got using this msal.ps module and pass it in when I connected to the Microsoft Graph. So now I was able to connect with delegated access to the Microsoft Graph endpoint.
Nothing convoluted there.
Nothing at all convoluted there. And surprisingly, it actually worked really well. So I was able to go in and I used set up stored credentials, was able to grab username and password out of that automation variable that has my stored credentials. And then you do have to go take it and actually create like a PowerShell credential object. And then you can go get an msal token, pass in those user credentials. You still have to pass in a client ID, pass in some other strings, get that token back, and then do the connect to MG Graph using an access token and go through and run all of these commands and get the presence with delegated access. But it was a nice little workaround. One, I had never run into anything before that didn't have delegated permissions where I had, or didn't have application level where I had to do it as delegated access. And then two, connecting to the graph when I couldn't actually use, for that reason, I couldn't use managed identity. I actually had to connect in this method.
Yeah, that's a strange one. So in this PowerShell module, I'm just kind of looking at it and going through the documentation. So it just returns a PS credential for you, but kind of with the bearer token wrapped in it. So it looks like they just go out and they have a get msal token commandlet. And that'll retrieve a token, like you said, pass in a client ID, give it a scope, like, hey, I'm going to do like user.read on the graph. So that's the permission I want back. And then you can just take that, and once you have the token, from there it's all just REST calls or native commandlets, as long as they recognize that credential object.
Yeah, that's it. So I would get back. So you get back a response. So you have to pass in a PS credential object. So that's what you pass in when you actually get the msal token, is a credential object. And then you get back your msal response. And then you can do like access token is your msal response.access token. And then my very next commandlet is connect mg graph access token with my variable. That's my access token. And then, yeah, you're in and you can go run get mg user. You can go run whatever graph commandlet you want with that delegated permission access.
Whatever thing you need to. Yeah.
Whatever thing you need to.
That's interesting. So this commandlet, like I'm also trying to figure out. So it looks like it's auto-generated from msal.net. So it's just using the .NET library in the background and then marches to that, which is kind of cool, I guess, as long as they're keeping it up to date. I'm trying to look at like the commit history on the Git repo. Some stuff is like 5 years old in here, but then they're doing refreshes on parts of the source. Like I see they just made an update to the actual PowerShell script, like the git msal token script, just a couple months ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much. I mean, to your point, there's a whole bunch of other PowerShell modules in there. So I'm not 100% sure how much all the other ones are used, but you're right. That get msal token looks like it's been updated fairly regularly. I don't know what the version history is on it. History? Yeah, that one has like 4 commits in 2021, 4 in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, a bunch of them in 2020, few in 2019. Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully it keeps working, because if it doesn't, I might run into problems, or they just need to update the graph so you can use application level permissions against get mg user presence.
Well, I mean, one can always wish.
You can, but I don't
Hopefully
know.
you submitted your user feedback for that one,
I need to go in. I have not submitted any user feedback on that one yet. I probably should go in and submit some user feedback around, hey, can we get this get presence updated for app level permissions? But there's a few things. So I don't know what it is about getting the team's call stats, but I did see this. This was get presence, but there's also a whole bunch of graph PowerShell commandlets around getting some of that data around calls, get call history, get some of the call stats, all of that. It seems like that whole calling Teams endpoint functions that way, because I did see some of those other graph endpoints actually only having delegated permissions as well. I don't know.
Yeah. It happens. I think it's a good call out, though. So there's a fairly comprehensive like graph reference when it comes to graph permissions and all those kinds of things too, that folks can go check out.
Do you have that handy?
I already put the link in Discord for you there,
You already
buddy.
put the link? Oh, see, there you go. I'm not watching Discord. Oh no, it was flip-flopped. So get this. Call record. So all the presence was app only. All the like get call record does not support app. It was get call record was another one. That one's the exact opposite. Delegated is not supported. Only application level is supported when you're getting call records.
Yes, no delegated permissions for call record permissions.
So is there a reason? So I don't know. I've never dove into the rationale of why you only have application or delegated on certain ones. Is it just developers not implementing it? Is there a technical underlying reason for that? Do
It
you
might
have any
just be
idea?
the use case for it. Like when you think about user versus application automation and what needs to happen. So like a user needs a permission to read out of their mailbox. Like they need to be able to read
Yep.
item A, item B, item C. And an ISV who say is developing a backup application for Outlook would also need the same, but they need it in context of application permissions and kind of that controlled constraint set. So I would be willing to bet that some of it's just the ultimate, like the use case or kind of the persona behind it. So something like call record permissions as a user, when do I ever need to go out and look up
Get
my
call
call
records.
record? Yeah, like I would never need to do that. Or like call routing log data, right? Like there's like a call record, PSTN calls read.all, which allows an app to read the PSTN and direct routing call log data without a signed in user. Okay, sure. Like I don't know why I'd ever want to do that as a user and have it out there. So it probably shortens the API surface, makes it a little easier to maintain over time.
Got it. And maybe that's the reason for the get presence, I guess. I mean, as a user, you want to get your own presence. It's probably how Teams and Outlook and all of those work.
Yep.
But I would
It
think
also
that
gives you that gate into like
applications,
admin consent and things like that, right? Like I think about like most app permissions actually require admin consent, and like the
right?
user side they typically don't. Again, taking like the Outlook management kind of thing, like managing somebody's mailbox requires admin consent versus not admin consent for me to just sign in and have permission to my mailbox.
Yeah. I guess I just thought that getting user presence would be something that applications would write against. Again, reporting reasons, or I don't know how some of the like Viva Insights works when it looks at trying to find focus time for you. I guess that's probably looking at calendar more so than presence. But I feel like getting user presence would be an application level or something people would want to do, even as an ISV, is to get user presence, unless it's seen as a privacy thing. Like, we don't want you to be able to monitor people's presence all day long.
So I see presence in the list of permissions. It has both delegated and app permissions. The difference between them being that presence delegated permissions have more granularity than application permissions do.
So is it on the way in the documentation just isn't up to date?
So,
Although it
I'm
clearly was
looking.
not working.
App permissions are presence.readWrite.all, and then delegated permissions you have presence.read, present.read.all, and present.readWrite. So you have far more granularity on the delegated permission side, and you only need admin consent for writes. Versus app permissions are wide open. It's read write all from the get go, and admin consent is required up front.
Got it. So in theory, should I have been able to get this working with application level, even though it
It,
clearly did not?
in theory, it's a different endpoint than the delegated permissions as well.
And maybe that's it. Maybe the PowerShell commandlet uses the only the delegated endpoint, and it doesn't. There is nothing running against that application endpoint.
Could be, yeah, because then you also end up in the whole like, am I in like a /me endpoint, or am I in a slash whatever /group /users kind of endpoint like that?
Yeah, interesting. So I suppose I could go back and rewrite my PowerShell to just do a REST call then, instead of using the commandlets that are nice and handy, and I should be able to get it working with app level permissions.
Yes, and being that the commandlets are just wrappers for the REST APIs anyway, it might be a little bit easier for you to do, depending on what the JSON looks like when it gets returned from the REST API. But
Yes.
theoretically, you could swing it. Were you willing to just do an invoke web request versus a managed commandlet?
Get MG presence.
And now all of a sudden we're back to Scott's whole thing where he just talks about REST APIs all the time.
Yeah, we need to get you out of this REST APIs. What else do you want to talk about? What
REST
non-REST
APIs are
API subject?
great. It's where it's at. But yeah, I like just looking at the documentation. I think this would be doable for you to do with an application permission for that specific example of being able to do user presence with an app only permission. I think you could pull it off.
I think I could pull it off if I did invoke web request instead
Yep.
of.
And I wonder if that simplifies, like, and there's probably, so this is kind of like one of those things I always struggle with too, is when you're doing these kinds of things, the
Yep.
upfront kind of Jenga that you play to get it all together. And then you go like, okay, it's working, but how hard is that going to be for me to maintain long term? And given my long-term view of the world, should I come back and revisit this now? Maybe should I come back in like a couple weeks, a couple months, whatever it is, and say, hey, I need to recheck this because it is the Rube Goldberg machine, back to that crumbling house of cards thing. Like
Right.
at some point, it could all come down around me. How resilient do you want to make it? And how important is it to have that be a long-term viable solution?
Yep. Well, and like you said, I would say the one dependency I have here that is probably the most likely to come crumbling down would be that msal.ps module.
And even that, I think you're okay with, like, as long as it's pulling from the .NET one. It's going to be more like, hey, did something monumental shift on the identity side? And if there's a monumental shift on the identity side, and then you're dependent on an SDK, which makes your PowerShell module dependent on that SDK, and then it becomes a little bit weird, right? You might be just better off saying like, hey, I can get a token this way and go down this path and just call an API endpoint and be done with it and parse some JSON.
Yeah, and I guess the other advantage to be going that other way and flipping it over would be I could go back to using a managed identity instead of using some stored credentials that have an MFA bypass in place.
I think that's another consideration for you, right? Is just kind of the security side of it and what that looks like. I know in some organizations, like now you're down the path of like going and getting exceptions, documenting those. Does the next person that picks it up know what to do with it and why that was put together that way, kind of thing? I would lean towards service principal or managed identity, kind of as a guiding principle or as like a guardrail first, and then you kind of do the exception out of it from there, which it sounds like you were kind of forced into the path of exception. But over time, ideally, like you'd want to be in a non-exception world if the functionality exists.
Right. So I think that would be my other reason is just go get this out of that username password type scenario and go back to managed identity. Because I should find this, Scott. Even maybe I shouldn't talk about this. You can still get the password in plain text out of a stored credential object in
yes,
PowerShell runbook. And it is not that hard. It takes like 2 lines of PowerShell to go grab the object and then pull the password out in plain text.
Yep.
If you have access to the automation account, you can go find the password, even though it's encrypted and all the UI stuff.
Yes. Yep. You run into the same thing, like, users with like elevated permissions in Key Vault, like, hey, can they view a secret? Can they create a new secret, overwrite the existing one? Like, I don't know. Probably one of those things where from your lens, like it works today and maybe you watch it for a little while, but, take away the learning that the next time you have to do it for the next customer, there's potentially a different path or a different way forward there for you.
Right. And like for this one, we kind of got the information we wanted to, so I don't even know that we'll run this anymore. So again,
well, now it's
like,
all
go
over
back
then.
and fix it.
Easy.
Get rid of it. But it does cost me. So to run, if you ever wanted to know, to run this runbook with Logic apps and run it that often, every 20 seconds I ran it for a full 24 hours. I was curious. I'm like, all right, automation account, a script that runs, it takes between 30 and 45 seconds to run the runbook. And my Logic app has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 six actions in it. It has a recurrence trigger. It goes and creates the job. It gets the job output. It does a compose of the JSON output, parses the JSON, and then writes an Excel row to a table. So running that every 20 seconds along with the Azure Automation runbook cost me in the ballpark of about $7 or $8 a day. I burned through all of my free Azure Automation minutes and Logic App things in about 16 hours, I think. Because I think the first day it cost me about $3, and then it was like in that $8 range every day after that.
Yeah. So the other thing here too is, if you're open to going just the REST API route and making like some concessions there, you potentially retire the entire Azure Automation component of it as well, because you could theoretically just run everything out of your Logic app, whatever it happened to be. And you
Right.
might still have places where you have to call out to more, I'll call it managed code, but it could be like .NET or PowerShell, anything like that you could still run inside of maybe something that's a little bit more resilient or better suited for it, like a function app versus an automation runbook.
Right. Well, in theory, you could just call it straight from an action, right? There's an HTTP get, HTTP call action in Logic Apps. And
so you could do it right from there. You should be able to do gets and posts and patches and kind of all the things that you would need to do. I think in this case, you'd be doing like gets or posts against it. You should be able to accomplish both. And then, I'm kind of wondering behind some of the decision process, run it every 20 seconds, but you know that it's a job that takes 40 seconds to run. Like, I'm curious, like how you land on that and rationalize that.
This one was the call queues specifically. We were trying to get status when the phone rang. Their specific call queues rings each user for 20 seconds. So the hope was that by running it every 20 seconds, we would grab all the statuses when a phone was ringing. And even though it took 40 seconds to run, some of it was the queuing up. So we like trigger it here, and then it takes a minute to run. So it grabs the status maybe 40 seconds later. But then the next one starts up 20 seconds, it staggers it by 40 seconds. So even though it was a 1 minute window, because we're triggering every 20 seconds, when we grabbed it was like offset by 40 seconds from when it started to when we actually grabbed the status.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it was based on how long a user's phone rings and wanting to try to grab the status whenever a phone would be ringing.
And then you potentially go back and dedupe it later in case you caught like a double run, depending on how quick or how fast the execution went. Gotcha.
Yep. And we were even doing some things too, like writing to the spreadsheet. I mean, we were grabbing status, users, what call queue they were in, all of that. So we could even go look at like, okay, all the users in this call queue. Then you could go back and say, okay, they went and do not disturb at 8 a.m. and they ended up in meetings, presenting, et cetera, till 3 p.m. where their status didn't change. So any calls that came in that range would have skipped them essentially and gone to somebody else in the queue.
Yep.
So it was trying to get a bunch of that information in terms of there was definitely duplicate information in there. But it was just trying to grab it all, figuring, like you said, we could dedupe it, we could filter it down, we could do whatever we wanted to with it later.
Yeah, makes sense.
But that was the rationale for every 20 seconds.
All right, very good. And see, you were worried that we couldn't spend 30 minutes on this. Here we are.
Oh, we absolutely spent 30 minutes on it. So that was the tale of my managed identities in Microsoft Graph and Teams status.
Your managed identities that couldn't be managed identities.
Yes, and my goal now to go back and switch these to managed identities and see if I can do it all with an invoke web request. Now I'll just do it just for the curiosity's sake.
I mean, try it out. It shouldn't be a heavy lift, right? To go back and ramp it through once.
It should be pretty straightforward. So awesome. Well, thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you.
You get to come up with your topic for next week.
Yeah, I'll see.
See, I can't even pin you down. You're smarter than I am. You don't mention it on the week before. Smarter man than I.
I try. So, yeah, we'll return next week.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Scott. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Ben.